So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining for what I hope will be a fascinating discussion about how the social sector can rethink and rebuild through and beyond COVID-19. Before we start, we need to go through the usual sort of housekeeping stuff, which I hope everybody's aware of. As you know, the event's being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, and there will be journalists present, so if you don't want to be recorded, I suggest you turn off your video. For those who enjoy social media, the hashtag for the event is #Rethink Rebuild. Feel free to use that during the event. We'd encourage people to use the Zoom chat function. There's a number of NPC staff who are ready to engage in conversations and collate questions, so please feel free to do that. And then what we're planning to do is do a number of talks from our guest speakers, and then deal with questions at the end. So we'll try and moderate it that way. For those who don't know me, I should introduce myself. I'm Vaughan Lindsay, the chair of NPC. For those who are new to NPC, NPC, for those who don't know it, is a think tank and consultancy for the social sector. NPC relies on its funding, particularly for its think tank work, to influence change and drive forward improvements. And we are grateful for all the donors and funders who've supported our work. And in particular, we're particularly grateful for the Gatsby Foundation for the work we're talking about today. As chair of NPC, I'm really excited to share with you our sort of Rethink, Rebuild program. It's about exploring new ideas of how charities, funders, and others in the social sector can be part of rebuilding our economic and social fabric after the damage caused by COVID-19. And to be honest, what it's done is also highlighted some of the systemic and structural issues that sit beneath our society, which is just heightened. We remain sensitive in thinking about doing this event. We remain sensitive to the fact that people are, facing all sorts of challenges in their day-to-day work. And most people that I've spoken to are heads down, just coping and surviving with some particularly challenging times. But we still felt it was worthwhile and right to give ourselves time and space to put our heads up and think about what are some of the ideas that we should be considering for the future. So I hope this provides a good stimulation for that. This event is about kickstarting some of that process. We know that at NPC, we know that we're not going to crack these challenges as individual organizations working alone. We think Rethink and Rebuild is about trying to encourage us to work across and indeed outside the sector to develop some of the best ideas to help us to develop an even stronger social sector for the future. We've started our contribution to that by publishing some ideas on a thing called NPC Labs, which is our platform where we're putting some emerging ideas that people can comment on and add on. So please feel free to have a look at that, and you'll see some ideas covering grant making, better collaboration, better policy making, and we'd be keen to get your inputs and thoughts on that. But today we've invited a really fantastic panel of speakers to give us their perspective on some of the challenges and new thinking that we should be considering, and really looking forward to hearing from them. And as I say, what we'll do is we'll go through each speaker one at a time. They've been asked to say a few words, and then pick up questions at the end. To start off with, I wanted to introduce everybody to Leah. Leah Davis is our head of policy and external affairs at NPC. Leah has a distinguished track record in policy and strategy development, having worked as a strategy director and acting executive director at the UK's leading environmental think tank Green Alliance, and as a senior advisor at the Mayor of London's office. So I was going to ask Leah if you would mind kicking off, and then we will go through each of our esteemed speakers in due time. Over to you, Leah.
Thank you, Vaughan, and thank you to everyone for joining us at today's event. Now, as Vaughan said, Rethink Rebuild is a big new project for NPC, and it's all about working with charities, funders and the social sector to come up with new ideas and solutions to help us rebuild and come back stronger, both during and after COVID-19. But it's also about understanding the role of the social sector in the social and economic recovery of our country. And the reason that we're doing this project now is because we think we've got a real opportunity, a window of opportunity to make some change. But we think this window of opportunity could be quite short. So we think we're going to need to think big, and we think we're going to need to act fast. So there are a number of ways we can look at the challenges that we're facing. And you'll see from this slide, the approach that NPC has adopted is to think of it like an iceberg. So if you think about the waterline, above that iceberg are the events. They're the challenges that we can see that the sector is facing at the moment. It's the kind of events that we see specifically probably caused by the Covid-19 pandemic itself. So alongside tens of thousands of deaths, we know we've seen a lot of social impacts. We've seen lots of inequality in how COVID-19 is impacting different social groups. We've seen increasing levels of poor mental health. We've seen waiting lists increase for things like cancer treatment, and I could go on. But we know there's also been some quite specific events and impact for the sector itself. So those delivering frontline services have been stretched. We know that for some, not all, but some charities, their incomes are going down, redundancies are going up. So we can see some very specific events that are really impacting the sector right now. But below that, there are a number of existing behaviours, systems and mindsets that have been around for a long time that are also affecting the ability of the sector to be as strong as it could be. So we know as a society, we're facing lots of social and geographic inequalities, but as a sector, we have lots of systemic challenges too. We have unequal power dynamics between our funders and our grantees. We sometimes have lack of information about what works and where need is. And we also have a lack of diversity across our sector as well. Now, what we think COVID-19 has done is some way moved that waterline down, so some of those existing behaviours and systems and mindsets have been a bit more exposed. But what we know is that to be able to tackle these, they're going to be big challenges, and simple quick fixes aren't going to work on its own. So we need to really think big. Now, we feel quite optimistic about our ability to be able to create some of these shifts at the moment, because we've seen some really great examples through the COVID pandemic of how charities and funders and others are already making these changes. So we've seen great examples where funders have been flexible in their funding and they've been fast. They've been given core funding and unrestricted funding charities to get on with and do what they know best. We've seen some examples of local authorities and more local charities, smaller ones, breaking down some of the usual barriers to how they can work together to tackle issues on the ground. And then we've also seen examples of surges in volunteering for certain causes and issues and changes around that charities have been able to harness. So we feel quite optimistic that we can create these changes. But as I said, we know that the window of opportunity is probably quite small to be able to make these changes, because a lot of the things that have driven the kind of changes we've seen have been caused by COVID. And with a really successful vaccine rollout that we have at the moment, some of those drivers could quite soon go. So, sorry, is anyone having trouble with my sound?
There was a little bit of comments about it, Leah. So I was wondering, I don't know whether it's plugged in. It's one of those dreadful things to try and get right. But you might need to put the microphone a little bit nearer to your mouth, I guess, on your thing, see if that makes a difference.
Okay, is this any better doing it like this?
A little bit. Try. Is it? Are you using the microphone on your doobie-doos?
Any better now that my headphones are disconnected?
Much better.
Apologies, everyone. So what I was saying is, we have a number of challenges.
Yes, that's better.
We have an opportunity. We have a really good window of opportunity right now to be able to tackle them. But we think that opportunity could be, and that window could be quite short, because a lot of the drivers that have caused some of the kind of really good examples that we've seen will be gone when we have the vaccine rolling out, which is going to be really effective. So we think we need to act fast. So that's what Rethink and Rebuild is all about. It's about coming up with transformational and practical ideas for the charity sector, working with charities and funders to find what those would be and trying to implement them fast. Now, the way that we're thinking about this, and we've started kickstarting, we've started to think about what some of those solutions could be. And what we've done is publish a lot of ideas today on our platform, NPC Labs. And this is where we put very early stages of our thinking. They were in no way refined. But the idea is we put them on there, and it's a place to test them, to get other people to comment on them, and to come up with new ideas as well. And there's 5 areas in which we are rethinking at the moment: grant making, collaboration, policy, data, and strategy. Now, you'll see a lot of ideas on NPC Labs, and I won't go through them all. But some of the ideas that we are thinking about that have potential. So under grant making, we're looking at trust-based philanthropy. So we know there are challenges and there's rebalancing that we need to do in the power dynamics. between funders and their grantees. And trust-based philanthropy is all about doing that. It's about rebalancing it. So it's as a funder, starting from a place rather than skepticism, one of trust. So rather than saying, why can't I fund this charity? What's wrong with it? We start from a place of saying, what could this charity achieve? And is there any reason we shouldn't fund them? So it's really about shifting some of the kind of perspectives of that. Another area we're looking under strategy is collective system strategy. So quite often organisations create their own strategy. They think about the system that they're working in, but they think about their role and how they can create the change they want to create. But we know if we look at that iceberg and the kind of systemic changes we need, thinking in that way probably isn't going to create the kind of changes we need. So collective system strategy is about working with other organisations within your system to think about how you can create a collective strategy to create the change that you need to at the scale that you need to. And finally, we're also looking at ideas around data and policy. So we know we have social and geographic inequalities in this country. And we now have a government that wants to help level up. But what we don't know sometimes is how charities can be part of that. But we don't have the data and the information to target need and to know where funders are already investing and to know where activities are already taking place. So what can we do to change that, to help make sure that policy is targeted at places where it's needed most? Now, as I said, we haven't got all the solutions and we've just kick-started the thinking today. And there may be well be areas that you think on here that aren't on here that you think we should be thinking about. So I'd really invite you to do that. We want to hear ideas from big funders, small funders, big charities, small charities, those inside the sector and those outside, because it's really only with new ideas and thinking that we're really going to crack this. So on that note, I will leave you so that you can hand over to the other speakers who will be sharing some of their thoughts and some of their solutions to some of these issues. Thank you.
Leah, yeah, thank you for kicking us off with some of the NPC thinking. I'm sorry for those who found the sound quality a little bit muffled. We all have to be a little bit patient as we try and tackle remote activities. So, but thank you, Leah, from that. What I now want us to do is to go over some thoughts from each of our panelists, and we'll do it in this order. We'll start with Adele, then Arvinder, then Joe, then Ravi, in that order. And I will share Adele's apologies. I know Adele has to shoot off at 4 o'clock, so good if we can start off with you. So Adele, thank you for joining us. And for those who know, I'm sure it doesn't need much introductions, but Adele joined MenCap as Chief Executive in early 2020. Prior to that, she's worked as Chief Executive of Cornerstone, one of Scotland's leading charities, and a former Metropolitan Police officer. Adele's background is in health promotion. She spent 8 years working for NHS Grampian and has significant experience in setting up and leading successful social enterprises and in developing new social care services. So Adele, would love to hear your thoughts and ideas, and then we'll move on to Arvinder after that. Over to you, Adele.
Thank you very much. How is the sound? Thumbs up if it's okay.
Sound is very good. Very
Great.
good.
I'd hate to launch into it and find everyone was struggling. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would just add one thing that I think is relevant to that introduction for today's discussion, which is that I'm also a trustee of the Robertson Trust, which I'm sure many people in the audience will know as a grant giver, funder and supporter of the third sector in Scotland. So I have 7 minutes, so I will crack on. Nobody, of course, would have wished coronavirus on the world. But I think our sector's experience of the last year, although it's been massively challenging, I think it has brought out and exposed some of the best things that our sector has to offer. The pandemic's also shone a light on many of the inequalities that we all know exist in our society. They were there before COVID. But many of them, things like poverty and trauma, ethnicity, disability, low pay, mental ill health, access to good quality healthcare. A lot of these issues have been amplified, both by the way COVID has disproportionately affected certain groups in a clinical sense, but also in relation to the country's response to the pandemic and what that tells us about the society that we all live in. It's been a curious time, without equal, certainly in my professional life, and I imagine I'm speaking for many of you too. Yet we have seen, certainly within MenCap and across the wider sector, charities and funders who have proved to be hugely resilient, very agile, creative and committed. It would be, I think, remiss of me at this stage not to mention and acknowledge the hard work, the resilience and the courage that I've seen from many of my colleagues, particularly those who are in the front line working within our social care services in the community. There are really no words to describe some of the sacrifices that they've made. We've had teams of people who've moved in to live with the people that they support to reduce infection, particularly when we've had outbreaks in some of our services. We've had colleagues who've slept on put-me-up beds on hospital floors to stay with a person that's dying. We have 4 colleagues who literally gave their lives. We've got colleagues who came into work over Christmas, if you remember when those last minute new restrictions were announced, and they came in and gave up their family Christmases just because we asked them to. Colleagues wearing PPE every day, however uncomfortable and hot. And on a more positive note, the joy and the kindness that they bring every day to their work. When the pandemic began, I think all of us in the sector mustered the energy and determination to respond really fast to unprecedented change. We stepped up, we muddled through what was a difficult set of threats and uncertainties, and we saw leaders at all levels in the organisations that we represent really step up to the challenge. Band together, I've never seen partnership working in the sector quite like this, and respond, I think, heroically. But many months later, with some light, thank goodness, beginning to shine at the end of a long, dark tunnel, the adrenaline rush of those early high energy sprints has faded. And I think the sector is now trying to sprint through what has become a marathon at an unsustainable pace. And as a result, we find ourselves in a potentially prolonged period of disillusionment, grief and exhaustion. Now, this is natural, of course, it's to be expected. And while the apparent success of the rollout of the vaccine gives us hope, it doesn't change the fact that a lot of people are still struggling. And if you layer on top of that forces that are fundamentally reshaping our society, things like technology, innovation, business model disruption, social inequality, workforce automation, many of us, I think, have a sense that we aren't likely to simply just bounce back to how things were before. However, I am always an optimist. And as the focus of this session today is Rethink and Rebuild, I just want to use the last few minutes that I have of this introduction to say a few words about the opportunities that I think we all now have to address inequality. I want to give you 2 quick examples of how MenCap, just by way of an example, as a result of the last 12 months, is thinking differently about how we want to work to ensure the biggest impact. We're launching our new big plan, our new strategy on April the 1st, and it brings an opportunity to ground a new narrative within our charitable purpose and our newly articulated vision, which is for the UK to be the best place in the world to live if you have a learning disability, to live a happy and healthy life. And we hope this repurposing will help colleagues to make sense of what is a new reality and regain a sense of stability. And we also hope it will reignite individual motivation and well-being and productivity. So second slide, please. In relation to inequality, you will all be aware, I'm sure, of the very successful campaign that not just MenCap, but other disability organisations and importantly, self-advocates and people with learning disabilities themselves led to prioritise everyone with a learning disability for the COVID vaccine. This was really an important campaign, not just for now in the context of saving lives, but it's also critically important for the future, because before anyone had ever heard the words Covid-19, people with a learning disability were experiencing huge inequality, dying on average 24.5 years younger than others in the general population, and twice as likely as you or me to die an avoidable death. And MenCap's Treat Me Well campaign has been running for many years, addressing things like access to healthcare, reasonable adjustments, accessible information, and the shocking but still occurring inappropriate use of do not attempt resuscitation notices, which we saw an increase of during COVID. And the vaccination campaign that was ably supported by our ambassador, Jo Wiley, provided an opportunity to really shine a light and unearth in the public consciousness the appalling inequalities that exist in the UK. And I know that you will all, as the audience here today, have your own examples of this, I'm sure. Next slide, please. So our response to the pandemic has also challenged us as an organisation to rethink and rebuild how we organise ourselves, how we spend our charitable resources, and where we decide to make investments for the future. Now, there isn't time to go into detail here, but I just wanted to share with you a real example of an organisation that is rethinking and rebuilding, taking our organisational, our traditional hierarchical structure and ways of working into a completely new model that's led by individuals with a learning disability, that's focused on communities, and that's based on a model of self-management and more empowered teams. And finally, and the last slide, I hope this is an acknowledgement that achieving positive change at scale is not possible unless those of us in the charitable and third sectors, and I include funders in that, really genuinely work together and support each other. We need to worry less about who gets the credit, who gets the money, and we need to focus instead on where together we can really achieve the greatest impact. So as we emerge from the exhausting and emotional roller coaster that we've all been on over the last few months, I really hope that society will remember why we all felt compelled to stand on our doorsteps and clap. And I hope that a spotlight continues to be shone on the vital work the third sector does in communities across the UK. And the Treasury, which is front of mind at the moment after yesterday's budget announcements, which were lacking in so many ways, although I accept there were some good messages in there too. The Treasury needs to recognise our sector's worth in economic terms and really make a commitment to invest. Thank you.
Adele, thank you so much for that. I think really helped ground so much of the discussion that we needed to have with a mixture of, actually the situation we face and some of the opportunities we need to embrace. So thank you so much for that. Can we move on? We'll move on in quick order. If we can move on to Arvinda. Arvinda, thank you for joining us and nice to reconnect with you after many years. So nice to see you again. And for a quick introduction for Arvinda, for those who don't know, is Chief Executive at Central YMCA. Arvinda is hugely experienced in community support and housing and has always successfully combined her commitment and passions with a real with enterprising support services for people from disadvantaged backgrounds in numerous roles that she's played. So really interested to hear your thoughts and perspectives, Arvinda. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Much of what I have to say echoes with what Adele has already shared. I think the first thing I would say is that we need to recognize that we're living through trauma. All of us are going through the most difficult time we're ever likely to see in our lives. And for the younger generation, that impact is going to be much more longer lasting than somebody like me at my age. We need to recognize that COVID has had an impact on us personally, professionally, in communities, in our localities, and of course globally. Julia Unwin has written quite well around this, which I think is worth reading if you haven't already seen. I think that kind of recognizing that we're living through this period, which is a seminal moment, really. Nothing is ever going to be the same again, regardless of whether we would like it to or not. Circumstances have completely changed the way we work, the way we engage, the way we're going to conduct our work in future. And that is going to be even more important for organizations in the third sector who are connected in a way with communities that we can only hope we can build on through the rethink and the rebuild. So I think that the things that I have been pondering and the things that we've been talking about at Central YMCA in a period when we've had to lose 1/3 of our income and say goodbye to many long-serving colleagues because we cannot continue to carry those costs, is how do we reshape what we do? How do we right size the organization, which has a history over 176 years of working in communities with young people and creating life chances for them? So some of the things I've been pondering is about how do we really explore the engagement with our community now? What is it we can learn from the trauma we've been through, the trauma we're going through, and how can we pick up the best bits? Adele mentioned the clapping in recognition of NHS workers, but actually the thing that strikes me most about what's happened is the actual conversations that happen on a street with people you've never met before, just because they seem to be taking a walk at the same time as you are. Our need to connect with other human beings when we have had to stop the normal connections we have in our lives have become really accentuated, have brought joy to us, have actually made us realize that somebody who lives on our street is somebody we should make time for. And those kinds of little things have actually changed the dynamics of how we live. And I hope that we carry on with those when we come back to whatever post-COVID looks like. The other thing that we have been exploring and I've been thinking a lot about is how do we really change the dialogue on diversity? How are we as a sector finally going to say we are going to lead in creating a sector that is really diverse, that's really true to what our society looks like now, and give opportunities to people from across those communities that do not get into leadership positions or do not get access to services or just are not seen as people we can welcome into the sector. I think this is another opportunity. The third one is, again, one that Adele said, which is around collaboration. The only way I think we should operate is through collaboration, is to find those organizations who are like-minded, who are trying to do similar things or complementary things in order to create greater impact in the way that we work in future. And in doing that, I think I've also been reflecting on our sense of place. Place has changed beyond recognition because of our inability to be with people in places. And I've been thinking about how the physical place, the need to be together, the need to touch other human beings, will become even more important in the era post-COVID. And therefore our community hubs will become critical in the recovery of from the trauma that we are living through. There is also this new virtual community that we have created, and how fantastic it is that you can register for an event. You can get more people registering for events than ever we used to have, because it doesn't require you to travel anywhere. You can do it from your home. It doesn't cost much money, and it means that you have greater reach. How fantastic is that? So our service delivery can change quite dramatically, creating a hybrid of in-person and online. And then the final one, which I think is the thing around a sense of belonging. Where do we belong? What is it that makes us feel that this is a place that we belong in? And how do we create those places so that people really do rediscover that sense of belonging in whichever form, whether it's virtual, whether it's physical, is another thing that I think is going to become really important. So recognize that we're living through trauma, recognize we have a huge opportunity to change how we worked, recognize that actually this opportunity will never come again if you don't grab it now, because it just does give us an opportunity to really, really rethink how we do things in future, how we collaborate, how we create greater impact, and how we change the face of the sector as a result.
Arvinder, thank you so much. Very thoughtful and stuff, and tempting. I'm going to stop myself. It's tempting to launch into questions straight away, but we will hold those back, and I think it gives good stimulation for discussion later on. Let's move on to our penultimate speaker, Joe Ferns. For those who don't know Joe, he's director at the Baobab Foundation. Joe's worked in mental health and suicide prevention for almost 20 years, starting with a frontline role, moving on to research at the Institute of Psychiatry, and then developing services and strategies at local, regional and national level, and international indeed. He was also executive director at the Policy Research and Development at the Samaritans, and also the UK Knowledge and Portfolio Director at the National Lottery Community Fund. That's a lot to say, Joe. But welcome. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I've recovered from all of it, so that's all right. Thank you for the invitation. I'm thinking about what to say that's different from what we've said already. But what I wanted to start with is the sentiment that we hear again and again at the moment, this sort of narrative that we are in it together. We're all in it together. And I think, as someone said not too long ago, we might be all in it together, but the depth varies rather a lot. And we've talked about the inequalities that have been exposed. And I think a lot of the time, what I'm often left with feeling, and the people I talk to, the only thing that's surprising about that is that we have the capacity to be surprised. I mean, everything's changed and nothing has changed really. So I think one of the things that I would offer as a thought for kind of what's next is that every organization's board, every organization's senior leadership team in our sector needs to be asking, what are we doing right now that perpetuates or challenges inequality? Because it's one or the other. There's no sort of in-between middle ground. And there's a danger that our response is too simplistic. There's a danger that we do something which is about the optics, which is too short term. The danger we clap and not actually pay our nurses anymore, or change the way that our systems are structured, or the way that people are disadvantaged by them. I think one of the things that we often encounter in this conversation, and we've seen it played out in the media recently, is that there's this sense that it's either or. We have to sort of look after people or do things for people that are furthest from power, or we have to do something that's good for everybody. And that's a false narrative, because what's good for people furthest from power is what's good for everybody. You want to be a better grant maker. You want to listen to people and really understand people's communities. You want to give people control. That's good for everybody. It's not just good for people who are furthest from power. I think one of the other things we'll see in the coming year is a move towards talking about the environment, which is a perfectly valid and perfectly reasonable thing to be doing. We should be doing it. We must be doing it. There's a danger in that a little bit, that it's a safe cause. It moves us away from things that make us feel uncomfortable, like we forgot our elderly, or that we stand on a pile of corpses. I think there's a challenge here that says, whose environment are you talking about? Is everybody's environment equally valued? Or are we seeing that people who live in poverty have less options? Are we involving everybody in the opportunity to talk about their environment? Or are we choosing some people to have a voice, or louder voices in that? And I think the question of voice comes at us for the rest of this year, and perhaps for the rest of our decade, as people who stand at the intersections of our society find that they have more in common with each other. And in that, they form uncommon alliances. And that maybe what we see is a less civil society start to emerge as a result of that. as people recognise that their voice isn't being heard, and so they start to talk more loudly. And I think some of that's begun, and we're very conscious of all of that at Baobab. You know, the organisation came about because we recognise that there are lots of organisations within the space of Black and ethnic minority community organisations who have had very different experiences, and we are a broad church. We now stand at 95 members. It's growing fairly rapidly. We've only been in existence for about sort of three months. And we're a foundation set up on the basis that the people who are closest to the work know best. So we're a foundation who's set up to be led by our membership. So the role of the foundation is to ensure fairness, it's to ensure transparency, but it's not to make decisions. Our role is to put the power to make decisions in the hands of our membership. So that's quite a challenging thing to do. There are lots of ways in which that can go wrong. There are lots of ways in which we'll make mistakes, and we've already made some mistakes. But it's a fascinating journey. There's not enough time here today to talk about all of it. What I can tell you is that we're in the midst of a research and development phase, which will complete in July. And between now and July, we're organising our members to be able to produce a strategy to talk about the impact that the foundation will have, not just as a funder, but also the impact on the funding ecosystem of the UK. So it's about how do we help funders to improve their practice? How do we understand the barriers that exist, and we add value to the sector as it is at the moment? But also, who are the audiences, who are the groups, what are the issues that we want to focus on as a funder? We need to finish fundraising the rest of the money. We're intending to launch with around £5 million towards the end of this year to immediately disperse in grant funding. And then we'll go beyond grants. We want to think about kind of other models, other ways of providing financial support to the sector. Because actually, you know, there's a risk that I know in only doing grants, we're sort of missing some of the more innovative ways of working. We've got lots of big organisations that have indicated support. Lots of commercial organisations from across the world are interested in contributing, and we're very lucky to have some progressive funders that have already started to talk to us about giving funding. So there's a lot to watch this space for, and I think you'll see a lot more from Baobab hopefully towards the end of this year. But if anybody wants to get in touch, I think the details are all on the website. So I'm happy to take questions either today, but you know, today isn't just about what Baobab's about, so there's opportunities elsewhere as well.
Joe, thank you very much. Thanks for that. And some good challenges about, you know, are you part of the solution or are you part of the problem, which I'm sure we can come back to. Let me hand over to our final speaker before we open it up to questions, which is Ravi Gurumurthy, who joined Nesta as Chief Executive in December 2019. Doesn't seem that long ago. And this week, I know Nesta have launched their 10-year strategy, which I'm sure Ravi will say a few words about. Prior to Nesta, Ravi was responsible for the International Rescue Committee's work in designing, testing and scaling products and services for people affected by crisis in over 40 countries. Covered anything from reducing acute malnutrition to intimate partner violence to expanding employment for Syrian refugees. So Ravi, over to you. The floor is yours. Interested to hear your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you very much. Well, as you just mentioned, my previous job was in the International Rescue Committee, and I was just reflecting on what I was doing sort of just over a year ago. And one aspect of what the International Rescue Committee does is help resettle refugees into 22 cities in the States. And when we were doing that work, we often used to reflect on the tension between the three objectives we had in that, which was partly to deliver amazing, innovative services to people in need, but also to be acting as an advocate and a change maker on behalf of and with refugees, as well as the third aspect, acting as social glue and building community. And we increasingly felt both that the latter aspects, that sense of being an advocate and a social glue, was more important than ever before, given populism and polarization, but it was also becoming harder and harder to do it while maintaining services and being funded by a government that was sort of attacking refugees. I do think there is this big question in the next few years about how those critical aspects of the social sector's role around campaigning and advocacy and social change and social glue can be maintained and enhanced while also preserving the service delivery aspect. Right now, at the moment, there are people campaigning against the fact that the aid budget for Yemen has been cut hugely, a place which is the sort of has the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But they're also having to think about, do they do that given the kind of money they're getting from government? So I actually want to focus more on that first aspect, however, that service delivery focus, but I just wanted to mention the other aspects of the social sector, which I think are critically important. But on service delivery, I think this is true for all sectors, not just the non-profit, but we have to think really creatively about how we mobilize some of the resources we're rich in, like people and data and private capital, even more so at a time when some of the public funding is going to become increasingly scarce in the next decade again. And I do think there is lots of opportunity here, which I wanted to just highlight. First of all, I think all services are going to be more people-powered. We've learned in this crisis how it's possible to mobilize hundreds of thousands of NHS volunteers through Good Sam, an organisation that Nesta helped to support. And that ability to mobilize and manage voluntary input, I think, is hugely powerful for so many different services. But we need to be probably better at how you sustain that enthusiasm beyond the crisis. How do you make sure you don't just use volunteers as cheap labour, but as really value-adding things that only volunteers can do? And also how you make public services really designed around being more porous and interactive and engaging of volunteers. And it's a hugely difficult task to do. So the first side of the future of public services, I think, is being people-powered. The second I would highlight is being more behaviourally informed. And by that I mean, we often think about the way to achieving an outcome like learning or care or health as being focused on what the NHS does and nurses and doctors, whereas actually it's usually the product of citizens, food manufacturers, a whole set of other actors. And what I think we need to be focused on is how we shift behaviours around learning and care and health. And that's, again, where the social sector can play a critical role, not least because one of the big ways of shaping behaviour is around social norms and social networks, which I think the community sector is uniquely well placed to mobilise. The third aspect is digitally enabled. And I think what's been interesting over the last year is that every single sector has seen a massive acceleration of digital online working. I think the future is going to be an interesting hybrid. Digital alone is not enough when it comes to teaching children or caring for people. You need to have that hybrid. What it can enable is an interesting blend and dosage of face-to-face versus online. So again, in the work that I was doing in actually refugee settings, we would blend some face-to-face input with children, but then reinforce that through online activity. And that was critical in that context because we couldn't actually access people safely. But I think it's a way of actually making services more cost-effective and engaging and sustained. And the fourth aspect I'd pick out is being data-driven. And there's such a glut of data, administrative data, all sorts of data that can be harnessed to predict and intervene early, to personalize services, to measure impact in a much more rigorous way. It requires an upgrading of skills. It requires thought about data ethics and data justice. But I think this is an example where many of the more commercial sectors are piling into it right now, and we need to sort of catch up because there's huge potential to do things in very innovative and creative ways. The final aspect I'd highlight is creativity around funding and finance. So there's been a growth in the last 10 years in innovative funding models like impact investing, crowdfunding, challenge prize funding. And I think we're going to need even more of that in the next few years. There is a glut of private capital, and we have had those innovative mechanisms that I mentioned, but they're still not very large scale. They often involve very high transaction costs, and they're not really easy to manage, particularly for smaller organizations. So I think we need to look jointly at how we can mobilize private capital, which we're rich in, to support some of these things. And that's where some of these changes I mentioned are highly interdependent. Some of the blockage on impact investing is around data and measurement. And the more that can be done easily through linking administrative data sets and making that accessible to frontline organizations, the more that some of the impact investing challenges can be addressed. So those are the sort of 5 elements that I think all sectors are going to have to step up to. I would just underline this last point that others have touched on around levelling up, because I think it's striking to me that this is a moment where levelling up is being defined. It's not well defined at the moment. And I think every single sector has to think about how it fits into and can utilise that. And this is an example where there is huge inequalities in volunteers, in charitable organisations, where in the most deprived neighbourhoods and the most deprived local authorities, that activity seems to be weaker. And I think we want the social sector to be counteracting inequality rather than compounding it, which is, I think, a big challenge, not just for the sector itself, but for government if it's serious about levelling up.
Ravi, thank you very much. Much food for thought. So thank you all for your contributions to that. And if you'll indulge me, I'll kick off with a couple of questions, if I may, and then we will open it up to broader questions, which I know the team are collating as we speak. And I'll start with you, Adele, because I know you'll be shooting off in a short while. But you talked a lot about partnership and collaboration, which of course, you know, intuitively everybody thinks is a good thing, and who's going to disagree with that? But how do you ensure that happens at a time when resources are getting so tight, and that often drives exactly the opposite behaviour, where people are trying to survive and just look after their own organisation rather than reach out and partner? So just interested in your experience about how do you make that work in such a resource constrained environment?
Yeah, great question to start off with. Yeah, I haven't ever met anyone, and I've worked in the public or third sector my entire career, who doesn't say, you know, either on their website or in their annual report or whatever, that they, you know, they work in partnership. And we know, you know, that the reality is that there is competition in our sector, and that in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think we need to be honest about, you know, we will be sometimes competing for supporters and donors. We may be competing for public sector contracts or for charities that are in that space. And I think that's okay. And that shouldn't preclude you from working in partnership in other areas. But partnership isn't just with other organisations for me, it's also relationships with people. And it has to be more than what you say. It obviously has to be what you do. And yes, you're right, when resources are really tight, then, you know, that forces, I guess, some organisations who are in the same space to need to compete, because that's the reality of survival for some charities. But the short answer or thought, it's not going to be an answer to the question, but a thought is that when we were developing, or have been over the last 12 months, the new big plan, as we call it at MenCap, and it is quite bold and ambitious, and it is different for MenCap, when we are going to become, I hope anyway, through our behaviours, quite a different type of organisation. We've talked a lot about our charitable purpose and our impact, and very quickly came to the conclusion that if our vision is for the UK to be the best place to live a happy and healthy life if you have a learning disability, what is MenCap's role in achieving that vision? And actually, it's more about being a catalyst, or providing a vital spark, or in some cases providing funding, or going to the communities and the individuals who are better placed to make that happen, because we can't do it on our own. We get the impact, and I think that's what's important, rather than, you know, who did the doing or who had the money. So hopefully you'll see over the next few years the new MenCap emerging, and that's the role that we want to play with people with a learning disability, working in proper collaboration and partnership, building relationships. And as long as the ultimate impact is achieved, then we are less worried, you know, who gets the credit, who's got the money, whether we did it ourselves or not. So I hope that helps to stimulate the thought rather than maybe answers the question.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think it should absolutely be a focus on the impact and less on who delivers it. And the most humble people are the people who realise they're not the best people to deliver some things and work in collaboration with others. But let me open up to the panel others' thoughts about collaboration. It's a sort of truism, of course, who's going to disagree with it, but actually incredibly difficult to do when resources are tight and it is a competitive environment. I don't know, I'll just open it up to Ravinder, Ravi, Joe, others to you may want to have any additional thoughts or comments?
I think I'll go first if you like. Well, I
Please.
think we talk about it. We often don't deliver on it because of all of the constraints around competition, keeping your niche, competitive edge, and so on. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think it's time to change that and to actually create partnerships where you're not competing for the same things, but actually complementing each other. And I'm sure that can be delivered in a way that really has an impact on the people that you're actually wanting to, in the end, make an impact on or make an impact with. So I think it's all about your attitude. It's, of course, resources are tight. Resources are tight everywhere. But we have to change how we do things if we're going to make this happen.
Agreed. I'll just pause for a moment in case anybody else from the panel wants to say something.
One thing just to add, Vaughan, is that a lot of organisations have said to me that it's been much, much easier to collaborate, not just within the social sector, but between lots of different sectors, because everyone's only had one priority. They've had one overriding priority, and that's why it makes sense to collaborate right now. Whereas when everyone has very competing short-term and different agendas, it actually is quite rational sometimes to not do things together. And I think it is worth just thinking the extent to which, particularly at a local level, more priority setting can be done collectively, and whether organisations are prepared to flex for the collective benefit of having a shared agenda. I think the other thing that's worth thinking about is how we do this in a way that has low transaction costs. Again, many people have said to me that working virtually has actually cut the transaction costs of partnership working quite significantly in certain respects. And that's where a bit of innovation about how you can maintain networks and understanding of what others are doing and where to plug in is something that's worth, I think, further development.
Couldn't agree more. I'm going to change topic just one other question for me, and then we'll start opening it up. Joe, I was very interested in your comments about the sort of a challenge to foundations, philanthropists to give away power. Something, again, one of those things that seems very appealing. But I'm just trying to say, how far do you think we should go in challenging foundations and philanthropists to give away power? And how do you do that and continue to sort of fundraise successfully? So provocative thought, but interested to see how far you think that, what the boundaries of that may be.
Yeah, I think, I suppose my answer to that is that we have to look at kind of what's the value that's added. And we have to ask ourselves the question that some foundations, you have to wonder, do they, some funders, do you add value to the money? Are you adding value to the process, or are you known for moving money? And people sometimes make sort of room for people with lived experience to have a voice, but it's usually in sort of quite a contained way and under certain sort of directions, or we're told, it can't be done at scale, or, these sorts of things, which I think is probably the wrong starting point. I think the answer to this is sort of similar to what I was thinking, listening to your previous question, that we have to think about what's our value and what's our purpose. So the value of collaboration, the value of participation is that you get a better result. So, what analysis isn't improved? What decision isn't improved by having a multitude of perspectives brought in at the beginning? What you get out the end of it is a more complete analysis. It's a more robust decision. So I think those things apply to both. As to where we're at in the sector, I think, I don't know is the short answer how successful the conversation will be. We've only just started it, about sort of whether people are willing to transfer power. I think there's a lot of anxiety, if I'm honest, amongst funders. I think people feel quite worried about this whole thing. And I think performative stuff has sort of been called out quite a lot, giving someone what 1% of the money that you have available, and then plastering your annual report with pictures and sort of making a big deal of it. I mean, I think people see through that. We're becoming more nuanced as a sector, perhaps.
Thank you, Joe. I mean, again, I'll just pause in case others want to jump in, but it leads on to another question, which I think Ravi, you raised about the use of data. In order to inform that assessment of impact and who to involve. I would, certainly in NPC, we would, echo your view that there isn't. It's actually very difficult to get hold of good and reliable data to make some of these decisions. And just interested in your thoughts about. Do you think we should be campaigning for investment in this area in the civil society so we can have better access and better use of data to inform some of these debates and decisions?
Yeah, and I think it's worth distinguishing what purpose we are using this data for. So I think the first stage is about working out what interventions work. And that's where I think actually larger organizations, whether in the public or private sector or voluntary sector, need to be involved in designing larger scale experiments and testing them rigorously. And organizations like the Education Endowment Foundation, I think, have done a really great job at building the evidence base in, say, education. Now, I think what's challenging sometimes, if you take a sort of small youth services intervention, for instance, it's quite hard for that organization to ever try to evaluate that rigorously, given the sort of size of the operation. And that's why some things end up serially underfunded in terms of evidence. But I think there is some work to be done to coordinate on investment in certain programmatic models to build the evidence base. There's then the question about how do you make sure that on an ongoing basis, your work, even if it's evidence-based, is being implemented well. And that's where routine measurement and monitoring data is relevant. And I think there is definitely more work that can be done to basically enable organizations to have access to administrative data or pool resources and capabilities to help social sector organizations, because it's really, really hard to do this, even for a well-funded organization, let alone organizations that have just got much less.
Other thoughts, other ideas from others on the panel? No, I'm going to start opening up. Adele, you look like you were going to say, I know you need to shoot.
I know,
off,
I was
so.
just going to say I have to go, which is rude. And I was sorry, I know you appreciate that I had something else in the diary, otherwise I would have stayed. I'm learning a lot and I'm being challenged by the conversation, so I'm sorry to have to go. But thank you, and I hope my input was helpful and speak
Really
to you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you. I'm going to start filling some questions that have come from the audience now, and then I think we have the capacity, although how this will be done for people to put their hands up and do this fills me with dread to try and do this remotely. But so the team have tried to collate some questions, and one which is sort of dear to my heart as somebody who's deep in the southwest of England, which is about sort of the regional diversities and the national diversities. So it's basically saying government's response to COVID has been quite different across the four nations. What opportunities and challenges does this present? It's one of my pet themes, to challenge a London-centric view of the world. So interested to hear people's views. If I can start with yourself, Avinda, because I know it's a topic you've spoken about.
I think the most important thing is to understand your locality and to have a lens on it which says, okay, these are the people we're reaching at the moment, but who are the people we're not reaching, and what is our plan to reach them, so that you take a much broader view. Often people say, oh, we're very good at reaching a particular group of people, and we will stick to that because that's working for us and it's creating huge impact. But actually we forget that there's so many hidden communities within our communities that don't get a chance or access and don't feel that sense of belonging that I talked about, and therefore will not come forward for the services.
True. Joe or Ravi?
Yeah, I think, we one of the things that we've been thinking about as we set up is kind of how do we tackle this issue? And there's always that sort of problem of, are you being too London focused, or are you focusing on sort of a couple of key cities? I mean, one of the ways that we're looking at it is that how do you decentralize power? So maybe the problem is that centralized power structures lend themselves to these sorts of problems. The other thing is about noticing who's missing. So just sort of building on what Linda's saying, it's about sort of thinking, a group of men, and this was put to us early on, having a meeting where there's a group of men sitting there talking and making decisions, those men don't notice that there's women missing sometimes. And so actually then when that's challenged, instead of responding with a defensiveness that says, oh God, well, I didn't mean it like that and I'm listening, and actually just saying, well, that's someone's truth. This is an objective truth. We didn't see it, and we didn't see it because we set it up as a problem in the first place. So I think it's about looking beyond your own perspective, which is easy to say, but everybody falls into it. I don't think any sector or group is immune to that, like what their version of normal is.
Thank you, Joe. Ravi, anything to add?
No, nothing to add, Vaughn.
No. Well, I'm now going to open up to questions. This is going to be spooky in the extreme. So I saw that Wendy had her hand up, which I'm always impressed that people know how to press the hands up button on these systems anyway, which is, I get easily impressed. So I thought I saw a hand up from Wendy, so I'm just going to invite Wendy to ask her question to the panel, and let's see how it goes.
Sorry, I didn't have a question. It was to say, to put your hand up, all you go to participants and the three little dots, and then there's the raise hand icon. So over to the next person.
Right, thank you, Wendy. That was me getting very excited that you were going to ask a question. So apologies if I missed that. Are there any questions from the floor that people would like to raise? We'll have to a degree of self-control so we don't drown each other out. But if people can put their hands up, then I can call them in. It's going to require me to flick through some multiple screens. Remarkably silent. Oh, Chloe Hardy, I see her hand. How are you? You'll have to, I think, take yourself.
Oh, every time.
I know, exactly.
I'm from the Sheila McKechnie Foundation. So this conversation, I want to ask a question which I have been thrashing over with colleagues from across the sector, across policy and public affairs and service delivery. And at the moment, there are no obvious answers to it, but how do we build a constructive post-COVID relationship with government without paying too high a price? By which I mean something like letting go of our right to campaign or advocate. Because currently the value of civil society only seems to be recognised where it's very small, it's very local, or it's very quiet. Those sorts of organisations seem to be very celebrated, and others seem to have the doors closed in their faces.
Chloe, thank you very much. And as somebody who worked many years ago with Sheila, delightful to hear the question as well. We'll go in the same order if we can. We do Avinda, Joe, then Ravi. So Avinda, thoughts?
Chloe, lovely to see you. Well, I think it is actually our responsibility to talk truth to power. I think we're failing in our duty if we don't actually bring to light some of the really intractable, so-called intractable issues that we deal with every day, and that we find ways of talking to government which don't have to be around talking to central government, but talking through our political advocates who can then talk to government. Because as we were talking earlier about how mirror imaging can actually be limiting in some ways, it can actually be quite powerful in other ways. So that if you can find the right channels and the right people to talk to the people in power, you can actually make inroads. But I would go back to my first comment, which is actually we would be failing in our duty if we didn't talk truth to power.
Joe.
I agree. I agree with that. I think the challenge is that a lot of people have given up. I think a lot of people just sort of are waiting for a change. I mean, I was tempted to answer with one line, which is the Obama, the Obama quote, vote. I mean, at what point do we say actually the settlement isn't right? I mean, there's a genuine issue there about like, how do you hold people accountable? A lot of organizations with volunteers are quite big outfits. They have quite a lot of people involved. And I think there's been a high degree of nervousness, hasn't there? I mean, the Charity Commission's position, amongst others, the concept of culture wars, like this sort of business of, it's not your business, sit down, be quiet, behave. I don't know. I mean, what's the answer to that? Apart from don't sit down, don't be quiet, don't behave.
Ravi?
So first of all, I don't know, but I think the few reflections. One, sometimes safety in numbers. Inevitably, if you can club together, then it's harder for a whole sector or coalition to be shut out. And the second thing, as Avinda said, you have to look at your own values as an organisation and actually stay true to them, because if you don't, then what have you got anyway? As I said, when we were in that situation in my previous organisation, we had this horrible choice about whether we potentially get our funding cut to help the refugees that we already were serving, versus having a duty to speak out against refugee bans under the Trump administration. And we argued a lot about it internally, about how on the front foot should we be, and we in the end were, very much so. The way we tried to mitigate that a little bit was telling some people in the administration in advance, having sort of private channels into them, so that at least some of the advocates within the organisation, within the administration, were going to be on our side. But it was obviously a big risk. In other countries where we worked in, where it was literally, if you did speak out, you'd be kicked out of the country. What we sometimes did was, to be honest, have a bit of a division of labour between ourselves and other organisations, and said, we are a humanitarian organisation. We're going to basically not get kicked out because we need to be able to try and provide some services, but we're going to pass information. We're going to support others who are more outrider organisations who are going to be in more campaign mode. And it's, I think, somewhat hollowing out of the organisation's soul when you end up in that very categorised way of working, where you're not able to speak out, but it can happen. I just hope we don't get there.
Sure. Thank you. I'm going to pass on to, in a reasonably imperfect way, people who've got their hands up, and I can see, Dominic, that you've got your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your questions, and we'll do my best to scan to see whether there's others with a hand up as well in my own way. Dominic, over to you for a question.
Thanks, Vaughan. And again, a tribute to Sheila McKechnie, which I think we both worked with her at Shelter back in the day. So it's nice to see you again as well. My question, one of the panelists talked about the importance of data. And I'm just really, I work at St Mungo's, and we've got a huge amount of data, and we run the Chain database, which is the Ross Sleeping database in London as well. And talking to other colleagues in charities and in the social sector, but it feels like we are very much behind the commercial sector in terms of knowing what to do with it, and how to do the analytics, and how to join it together with other organisations. So my question for the panel is, have we seen any good examples where funders or collaborators have come in to help make the most of the data that charities are sitting on, in order to get better impact and outcomes for our clients?
Dominic, great question, and nice to connect again as well. Great question. I will do in reverse order. We'll do Ravi, Joe, then Avinda. Ravi.
Well, I'm sorry to talk about US examples, which is not very helpful, but there's one example that just really springs to mind that was fantastic, which was we'd been resettling refugees for years in the States, had all this data that we're sitting on, didn't really think that it was that useful. Stanford University talked to us and said, can we access all the data about where refugees were from, where you resettled them, and whether they're employed after 3 months? Because we can build an algorithm that can help place people that matches their characteristics to the labour market. And at the time we were thinking, well, fair enough, this might have a marginal benefit, maybe not huge. But they did it, and they projected that it would potentially have a 40% improvement in employment rates 3 months after your refugee's place. And it was, and we actually then started a randomized controlled trial to test whether that was in fact true. Unfortunately, due to various things, it's not, due to COVID, etc., it's not been able to carry on. But I think that's a good example where sometimes you don't know what data you're sat on that can be of huge use. And that's where collaborations between academics or other people with data science expertise, and actually Nesta would fall into that category, and frontline organisations are really worth doing, and then perhaps jointly going to funders.
Thank you, Ravi. Joe, any reflections or thoughts from your experiences?
Well, one practical thing. I mean, I think what 360 Giving have been doing is very good. I think some of you will be familiar with them. If you're not, I'd suggest go and have a look. The things like Grant Nav, but other projects that they've been involved in have been, I think, really good. I think the other thing is just to echo what Ravi said. For me, this is one of those areas where it's ripe for collaboration and partnership. It's funny, we've just talked about two of those areas. One is voice and the other is data. And data feeds voice because the data is the evidence, right? I mean, and I think actually what's really challenging is at the moment, organizations often end up hollowing out their kind of research policy thinking stuff because things are really difficult, and quite reasonably people put resources on the front line. But actually the risk is then that thinking is gone, and actually it's really hard to put it back in once you've lost it. You sort of get stuck in a kind of doing cycle rather than a thinking cycle. And so I think it's one of those areas I would like to see funders contribute to. I mean, again, it's one of those challenges that is a real challenge within the sector. And again, without sort of bringing politics into it, who gets to choose what those priorities are? The sector needs voice, and it needs the evidence and the data to have the voice. So therefore, that should be where some of the money should be going right now.
Agreed. Arvind?
I don't think I have anything to add. I would totally agree with Robbie and Joe.
Yeah, and Dominic, I think you're right. You know, the private sector, you know, I think they put money into that for good reason. They put money into it because it really does provide insight and value. And you know, but it does take a little bit of upfront investment, and that's the challenge I think for the sector. Is getting the investment to bring that data together and do some sensible analytics. It's much harder than people think. I can't see any more hands up. I mean, I first admit that it may just be my incompetence on that, but I don't think I have. So what I was going to do is hand over to Seth Reynolds from NPC, who's going to just reiterate a few thoughts on the NPC side, and then we'll do a wrap up, and then we'll give you the biggest gift at all, which is potentially 5 and 10 minutes back to your lives. So let's hand over to Seth, if I can. I hope Seth is there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vaughan. And okay, thanks for the slides. Brilliant. Wow, thanks so much, everybody, for such a rich and inspiring conversation. I thought I was going to be speaking against the countdown, and so it's going to fall to me to speak extremely quickly. But as I'm not, I'll speak very slowly, and then you won't get your gift of time. No. We've heard some very powerful testimonies today, which taken together illustrate that this is both a crisis and an opportunity. As we go forward, we have to hold ourselves and others in both of these spaces simultaneously, which is in itself a huge challenge and perhaps a different way of working and being. So, you know, I just want to kind of emphasize that Rethink, Rebuild, as we've talked about today, absolutely doesn't mean turning our gaze away from the crisis or the real challenges that people are going through. It's actually to harness that energy to make the sector and our systems more resilient, more just, and more effective. As you may have seen in the invite, when we've been talking about this work, we've been saying that this is a moment of significant system shifts, which demand a systemic response. What we're interested in, NPC, is looking at how we turn some of those shifts into real permanent systems change. As Arvind said, it's a seminal moment. And a systemic response means that it's not time for flying solo, as we've discussed today a lot. Clearly, many people are thinking along similar lines at the moment, and similar things are emerging in various spaces, which makes this a moment that is ripe, we think, for real change. So we know that there are many important initiatives already underway, tackling some of these deep-lying structural issues, some having emerged as a result of the crisis, some predating it. And we know that this isn't a time for peering over to see what the competition are doing and trying to carve out a differentiating niche. It's a time to work together to build movements. It's about, as Adele said just now, thinking, well, what's my role? And how can we better coordinate with those with other roles? So working together can take many forms. It can be learning from others in shared spaces, such as this, and taking inspiration and reflecting on our own practice, so we've launched some of these recently, including a peer strategy network that NPC has established, exploring some of these questions, some questions of adaptive strategy, collective strategy, which has been spoken about today, and which are explored further in the new Rethink Rebuild site, launched today, little plug. It means adding your voice, and you can do so on that site, contributing to the conversation and speaking boldly and bravely about your perspectives, your ideas, and your initiatives, so that we can amplify urgent and important work together. It's about amplifying work that you believe has system-changing potential, such as we've been doing today, such as that of the Baobab Foundation, and we've heard from on the Rethink Rebuild site. We've looked at and profiled trust-based philanthropy, Ivar's work exploring progressive funding practice, really, really important system-changing things that are happening, but they need to happen together and not in isolation. It means forming alliances, allegiances, or partnerships with some of those initiatives, depending on different levels of formality, depending on, of course, your capacity and the synergies that emerge. And finally, we think it means experimenting and exploring. From NPC's side, we feel that we have some ideas, and we're lucky to be able to bring together a group of as fantastic and inspiring as this one today. But we definitely don't have all the answers. We believe that the models and approaches we need will emerge in conversation and collaboration with others across the system who occupy a different role, a different space, and bring a different perspective to ours. Next slide, please. So we think we have as NPC, we think we have a role to play in this movement to rethink and rebuild our sector, as everybody does. And we'd like to extend this invitation for conversation, continued conversation, collaboration, cross-fertilization, and ultimately co-creation. So if this call is one you feel drawn to, there are a few ways you can get involved. So you can add your voice, your ideas, your experiences, and your suggestions to the pages we've launched today, and the address should be here on the screen. Yes, it is, and also perhaps could be posted in the chat. These pages have been designed for conversation and not just content, so please do contribute there. We're sort of approaching it as conversation starters and some stimulation for this work. Some of you have already been doing. We want you can share your models, initiatives, programs, projects that you're running or you're involved in, or just ones that you've come across that you think connect to the conversation that we've had today and the aims described here today. There's important work happening across these 5 areas and in others. And as much as possible, as I say, it needs to not happen in isolation from each other. To build movements for radical change, we need to first build our knowledge of what's happening around us. You can stay informed just on a basic information level about what's happening through the programme by signing up for more information with the sign up form, and the link is there on the screen, and perhaps can also be in the chat. And lastly, you can work with us. You can continue to work with us in more depth as we further develop and explore some of these ideas and models through an upcoming series of roundtables and workshops for each programme strand. More information about these will be forthcoming, but in the meantime, here are the dates for your diaries. Of course, and you can indicate on the sign-up form, incidentally, which of these strands you're particularly interested in. Just we understand that there's obvious crossover. These things, as we understand, are too complex to separate, but we must separate them to make progress. But we are looking across as we develop each of these strands, but also taking a whole system view and sort of bringing out and connecting the themes and the ideas that are emerging between them. Of course, if you want to contribute in a way that doesn't fit into any of these categories, or you'd like to say anything else, you could drop us an email through the email address shown, and hopefully also in the chat. So finally, I'd just like to finish by saying that this is an emergent piece of work. It's a new way of working for NPC as well, but we're doing this because we know that the old ways aren't doing what we need them to do. That does mean that we are learning as we go. So we hope that you'll be patient with us as we do so, as we have all been understanding with each other as we've navigated new terrain over the last year, and will continue to navigate over the years to come. We'll keep trying to be open about our process and our learning as we continue on this journey. So thank you for listening and for being part of the conversation so far, and I'll hand back over to Vaughan to close.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'm glad you were able to do it not at pace. Very helpful as well. So thank you for that. And it just leads me to really to pass on thanks. I mean, we in organising this event, we are acutely aware of how challenging and difficult it is for many in the sector at the moment, and we're very sensitive to that. But we do think it is the right time to try and find space to think and relearn, so that we can rethink and rebuild in a structured way. Now, I think, as Seth has pointed out, NPC is also trying to do that in a different and far more collaborative way, which I hope people will find helpful. And as I say, we will learn as we go along. It just leads me to say, I mean, it was a hugely interesting discussion. Like all these things, you are left wishing for more, which is, of course, the best way to leave it. It's an opportunity for me to, first of all, thank all of our speakers, for Leah, for Adele, for Avinda, Joe, and Ravi. Thank you so much for your contributions. I think if we weren't all on mute, we'd all do a little bit of a round of applause, but I'm afraid that may look a bit weird. And we could do it silently, I guess, a silent round of applause. So thank you for that. As I said at the beginning, we'd also like to thank the Gatsby Foundations for their support that makes this possible. As in all these things, we do need support to do some of this forward-thinking work. So thank you for their support on that. The NPC team, they've been recording this and will be in contact with you. So if you want to get access to any of that, there's a huge number of links that you can use. And I wanted to use this as an opportunity to thank the NPC team, who has always have worked as Trojans behind the scene to make all this possible and hopefully make it also smooth. And just pass on my own relief that nothing went wrong on the technical side, which is always, in my way, something always goes wrong, and this time it hasn't. So thank you all very much for that. And as I say, my final gift to you is to give you back what I think is now going to be 7 minutes of your lives. So thank you for that. So thank you everybody for joining. I'll pause for a moment to see whether Rebecca or anybody else jumps in to say there's something I've forgotten. No, in that case, we should call it to an end. Thank you all very much.